Exciting moment for me. Matt Brooks told me that I was going to be speaking with you. He told me I got to play the role of journalist. And I said, well, it makes things very easy. I don't have to know anything. I can lie and there's no accountability. Yet, you're one of the few journalists out there who does know a lot of things, who doesn't lie, and who does take accountability. So I just, before we get to some of the questions that have been raised by speakers here, or the threats that Israel faces or we face, what's it like being a journalist in New York City?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for asking me to be here, and thank you for this huge honor which you've paid me. It's deeply appreciated, and so thank you. And thank you for all of the work that you all do. That's very kind, but besides the point. Well, the first thing is that as a journalist, as a writer, the most interesting thing is to look at the things that are most prevalent in the day, and particularly the things that are taboo or difficult. I never think it's worthwhile just saying what everyone else is saying or trying to run with the crowd. In fact, I think a good instinct as a writer is to have a sort of salmon-like desire to always go against the stream, go in the other direction. When I moved to New York a few years ago, all of my friends left, and I tried not to take it personally, but they all moved to Florida and Texas and Nashville and various other places. And they all said, why would you move to New York with all of the problems in New York? I said, what are you talking about? It's the most story-rich city imaginable. You know, an American city in trouble is a fascinating story because it tells you, and I often write about this in my column in the New York Post, but so much about America and its challenges in this century can be seen in a city like New York's problems. You know, people get used to the problems of a city like New York, but I can assure you that many cities in the rest of the developed world do not have people zonked out on drugs on the pavements everywhere, do not have people chanting for jihad everywhere, and, you know, other cities are quite nice places to live. So inevitably is a bit of disaster tourism in it. But no, I mean, I just think that there's so many stories. And this country, the reason why this country is important to me and why I've always loved it since I first came here in the 1990s, and by the way, rather amusingly, my family knew nobody in America. And I said to my father, because nobody had come to America before, and I got a small grant to write my first book, and I said to my father, do we know anyone in America? And he said, only the Trumps, which in retrospect is quite funny because Donald's mother grew up with my grandfather in a very remote Scottish island, and so when I first came to the States, I stayed with the Trumps. So life is very peculiar at times. But yes, so I love this city, this country since I first came here. But as a writer, I've tackled lots of issues, covered lots of wars and also peaceful things. But as a writer, you really have to be interested in America. I often say that you can tell whether a country is important or not by whether or not anyone knows who the defense minister is. And you know, in America, it actually matters who the Minister of Defense is. Luxembourg, not so much. No, Britain could yet be at a stage where no one knows. So, but America, everything matters about this country and what you do. And, you know, I always think, if America's doing well, every other democracy is doing well. And the flip side is, if America is going in the wrong direction, you don't buy yourself any time by living in Malta.
Well, so journalists are just one adjunct of the left, not just here in America, but around the world. So let's broaden our focus from journalists and the journalistic world in which you live. And let me just ask you, what has gone wrong with the left? Not just here in America. You can see it among Democrats boycotting Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech and Kamala Harris's vice presidential comments today. But it really is the global left now seems to be the hotbed of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Not always the case. Well, why is that? What's happened, not just here in America, but in Europe and around the world, that has caused such a fierce backlash, not just to Israel, but to Jewish life, culture, and the Jewish community around the world on the left?
Well, one of the fascinating things about anti-Semitism is that it is one of the surest ways in which you can test the health of a society. If a society has, anti-Semitism is never able to be completely eradicated. There will always be some people from whatever fringe. But if a society is pretty much inoculating itself against anti-Semitism, it is one of the signs that the society is doing well. On the flip side, if a society or a movement starts to indulge in anti-Semitism, you can always tell that everything else is going rotten. One of my great heroes was a Russian Soviet writer from the last century called Vasily Grossman. And he wrote one of the great novels of the 20th century, Life and Fate. He was also a journalist of great distinction, and he was also Jewish. He covered, as a reporter, the Battle of Stalingrad, and he also was the first journalist to walk into Treblinka. And in the middle of his great novel, Life and Fate, which is 900 pages, but I'll save you the time, in the middle, right in the heart of the novel, Grossman devotes 4 pages to the question of anti-Semitism. He's just covered the Red Army winning in Stalingrad. He's just covered the defeat of Hitler at Stalingrad, and he's about to go on to the camps. And he does 4 pages of just talking about anti-Semitism. He says something there that I wish was better known. He says, among other things, the thing about anti-Semitism is that you can find it everywhere. He says you can hear it in the songs that children sing in the schoolyard, and you can find it in the Academy of Sciences. But the important thing that Grossman says is, everywhere, it doesn't tell you about the Jews, it tells you about the person talking about the Jews. And the great insight he has is, he says, tell me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. Now, anti-Semitism can come from any direction. Historically, it's often come from the far right. But today, there are always worries about that, but today it is the far left that is the predominant place that is fostering anti-Semitism. And many of them don't know the swamps that they're in, and some of them do. These people who, after the announcement of the murder of an American citizen, marched on the streets of New York and were waving the flag of Hamas, know exactly what they're doing. But a lot of the left has fallen into anti-Semitism because it has basically got a new religion. Of course, the left is still playing with the embers of Marxism, but they also have this new religion, the religion of intersectionality. And this is the religion in which the more oppression you can claim you've suffered, the better you are. Now, who could have foreseen that this would lead to an oppression Olympics in which people are desperate to claim that they're oppressed, and that a student at Berkeley must feel like the most oppressed person in the world, so that somebody being pursued by the Janjaweed militia in Sudan has nothing on them as they enter their 3rd year of lesbian dance theory. and I would have said make themselves unemployable, except it turns out there's masses of jobs for these people to go into. They all went into HR and Silicon Valley. But this oppression Olympics, you could already see, leaves the Jews in a very perilous position. And I said this many years ago. They already were trying to make the Jews the kind of super whites. And then you have the thing of, what are the things that the American left is obsessed by? And I've written about this in my last book, The War on the West. They're obsessed by several primordial sins. The sin of racism, the sin of colonialism, the sin of slavery. They are people of stupendous historical ignorance who believe, for instance, that only America ever enslaved anyone, and that, for instance, the Ottoman Empire, well, it's not really come across their plate. They imagine that the history of Britain or Europe is only to be looked at through the lens of colonialism, as if the Renaissance is nothing, you know. Well, they don't know what it is, so of course it's nothing. And on and on. A majority of young British people polled the other day said that they believed that the foundations of Britain were racist. And you see the same thing in the left in America, and particularly in the young left. They have got this new religion. They think everything is about these things. You simply have to find racism, find colonialism, and so on. And why do I mention this? Because it comes back to what I just mentioned about Vasily Grossman. There's an interesting twist that the American left is doing. I don't think I've said this before, but I've been thinking about it a lot recently. If Grossman is right, and I think he is, that what you accuse the Jews of, you're guilty of, what is it the American left, particularly the campus left, are doing? They are accusing the Jews of something that they believe they themselves are guilty of. As it happens, they're incorrect. They believe America is a racist society. They believe that America is a colonialist society. They believe that America is a white supremacist society. Now, all of this is rubbish. But they imagine this to be the case. And it's all of the things that they're accusing Israel of. They say that Israel is a colonialist society. Tell that to the British in the Mandate era and they'd have been amused. They imagine that Israel is a white supremacist society, which I always say is one of the ways to show you've never been to Israel. And they believe that Israel, because they believe that America is based on genocide, they accuse Israel of genocide. It's a very clear pattern at this stage. There is no other reason for them to level these extreme allegations that are so flagrantly untrue.
So the passion you see on the American left in condemning Israel and launching these calumnies against it has increased in the last 20 or 30 years because of the passion on the American left for this intersectional worldview that they've grafted on to Israel and the Middle East.
Oh, absolutely, because, I mean, you know, and in the early, one of my best friends made a huge influence on me was a friend called George Weidenfeld, who was born in Vienna in 1919, fled the Nazis in 1938, came to London, was Chaim Weizmann's secretary at the foundation of the State of Israel, and he died 10 or so years ago. It's my great pleasure to have him as a dear friend. I used to ask George often, he was a man of the left himself, when it changed. And he said, Douglas, it was 67 and then 73. He said the left loved Israel in the main until Israel was winning. And now, gosh, this is even more true. If you look at the world and you believe everything is about underdog and overdog, who has the power, and you create this new power structure in which, you know, Israel is not the David but the Goliath, you can accuse Israel of anything, and that's what they're doing.
How much of it, both here and in Great Britain, is it the fact that a generation of left-wing politicians in the Democratic Party and the Labor Party viewed Israel as their natural ally. You know, Labor governed Israel for its first 30 years. And then what they viewed as this alien party, the Likud party, took over about 50 years ago, 47 years ago, I guess to be exact. And it's largely been center-right government since then. And, you know, today you often hear the government of Israel condemned as the most right-wing government in Israeli history. But if you look at demographics and voting trends in Israel, it might also be the most left-wing government in Israel's future as well.
Yes.
So how much of that do you think plays a role in our countries?
I think there is almost no understanding outside of about Israeli politics. I think that almost everyone is completely ignorant. They cannot understand it. One of the things I've been trying to tell people in the last year, I've spent most of the last year in Israel since the 7th, and been living rather curiously with the residents of a town from the north who've been displaced. By the way, everyone talks about Palestinian refugees and nobody talks about the tens of thousands of Israeli refugees. But one of the things that I've been trying to say to the media and wherever I can is, you know, you all think that the problem is Benjamin Netanyahu. And almost everybody in the Western press thinks this. I always say, you have no idea of the fact that, and I can say this having met and interviewed almost every opposition leader, every potential replacement for him, every single Israeli politician of left, center, and right would have prosecuted a war against Hamas after the 7th if they'd been in power. It is just not the case that there is, you know, it's a sort of Netanyahu problem, but that's always what they obsess with. People say to me sometimes, what if Benjamin Netanyahu was replaced by somebody else? Wouldn't it buy Israel more time? I say, oh yeah, sure, about 24 hours. And before you know it, they would accuse the most left-wing leader in Israel of being a far-right extremist for daring to protect the Israeli nation.
Well, I mean, we saw that in display last year. I mean, when President Herzog spoke to the joint session of Congress last year, numerous Democrats boycotted him as well. And whatever you think of President Herzog, there's no question that his family is a distinguished political family of the center-left in Israel. And when you're boycotting not just Prime Minister Netanyahu, but President Herzog as well, your problem is not Benjamin Netanyahu, your problem is Israel. And that's the problem that so many Democrats in Congress have today. Speaking of Prime Minister Netanyahu, you know, we've heard in this country there was Bush derangement syndrome first, and now there's Trump derangement syndrome. It does seem that not just here, but in Israel as well, there may be a degree of Bibi derangement syndrome. I have to say it was remarkable to me to see after Hamas executed in cold blood 6 hostages last weekend, executing them because Israeli troops were closing in on them, that the reaction you saw across so much of at least large cities in Israel were protests in the streets against the prime minister. You had the Histadrut shutting down the nation in a general strike before it was ordered to stop by court. So many people speaking out against Prime Minister Netanyahu as if he was the one who had executed these hostages, or he was the one who was holding them hostage himself. What do you think accounts for that on the Israeli left?
Well, I mean, this is something which I find profoundly disturbing. I have done for many months. There are people inside Israel and out who behave as if the hostages are in Benjamin Netanyahu's basement. It's quite appalling. And after the murders last week, the world media and politicians behaved as if Benjamin Netanyahu had killed them. I think one of the only explanations for this is we in the West are so far away from reality today. We are so far away from understanding the reality of evil. Hannah Arendt used this famous, awful phrase, the banality of evil, and she was completely wrong. Evil is a force that when you see it, you will never forget it. But Americans don't see evil like Israel saw on the 7th. when you do polls of young Americans asking if they'd fight for their country, or those figures are terrible, but they have no concept of ever needing to do that. They have no threat from Canada yet. And it's the same in Europe. Most of Western Europe, less now in Eastern Europe since the Ukraine war. But the idea of what you're actually dealing with Hamas is just a different world than the world that somebody buying their morning frappuccino in a Starbucks can imagine. And this is one of the things that has startled me in the last 11 months, is one thing in particular has haunted me. Many things have, but one thing I can't get out of my head is the sheer lack of empathy. The sheer lack of empathy for the Israeli people. I think so often of the survivors of the Nova Party, who I've spent a lot of time with, and I wonder so often why do their contemporaries in America, who would love to, who'd go to a dance, rave, or whatever, why don't they all think, God, that could have been me? Why when the survivors of the Nova Festival come to New York, do they have to face down people in the streets outside hating them? Israelis are the only people in the world who, when they're attacked, then get attacked again. And the sheer lack of empathy for the situation Israel is in is just startling to me. And it's unforgivable for the people who've indulged in it. Remember, we've had in recent years, believe all women. And it turns out that doesn't apply if the women who are raped are Jewish. And we had the world, when I covered the conflict in northern Nigeria some years ago, when the northern Nigerians, Chibok schoolgirls, 300 of them were stolen from their village in northern Nigeria. Michelle Obama and every influencer on Instagram held up the rather futile, but still nice, hashtag bring back our girls. Where were these people when the girls were Jewish? And the sheer lack of empathy for the situation they're in just startles me.
A lot of what we've been discussing, a lot of what we heard this week, and frankly, the news from Israel has been solemn and saddening. So why don't we end on what I think will be a more uplifting and inspiring note. As you mentioned, you've spent much of the last year in Israel, and much of that time with the young men and women of the Israeli Defense Forces. So could you just share a little bit of firsthand testimony about what you saw from those troops and what lessons we might draw from them?
I got to Israel as soon as I could after the 7th, and I went straight to the massacre sites and felt it was important to sort of bear witness to what had happened, because I feared that it was going to be covered over very fast. Everyone would talk about Israel's response, the retaliation, the revenge, as they like to say. And I spent a lot of time with the families of the hostages, of survivors in the hospitals and elsewhere. Went to the morgues of Tel Aviv when the pathologists were doing their terrible work. But there are two things that really, really stick with me, and I hope always will stick with me. The first, of course, is the horror of the day and of what people were put through. And nobody who's seen them or spoken with them can ever forget the victims. But the second thing is the heroism that was on display on the 7th from individuals. We've heard from some of the people from United Hatzalah, but people who just drove south and helped and fought. And then, most importantly, the young men and women of the IDF. I've been in Gaza with them and seen them in their careful, incredibly dangerous work. Where if they open a tunnel shaft, the booby-trapped, somebody, when those 3 poor young men were shot who were hostages earlier this year, every time a group of people come out of a building with a white flag in Gaza with their hands in the air, almost every time somebody will come through the middle with a Kalashnikov to fire at the Israelis. This is really difficult terrain. But the men and women of the IDF, they've answered a question which everybody has on their minds always, which is, if we were put to the test, as our parents and grandparents' generation was in America and in Britain, would we be able to live up to their example? And it should haunt everyone. This always haunts generations in Israel. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that that question has been answered by this generation. They have been weighed in the balance and been found to be magnificent. And just finally, I can tell you, when I see a 19-year-old girl helping with collecting the body parts and doing it because it's her job, when I see a young man who spent months in Gaza, when I see these people on the front line, always I think of this thing: what are your contemporaries like in America? And these young men and women show up their American and British counterparts to such an extent they should be embarrassed. I'll just leave you with this thought. These people, these young men and women have seen things by the age of 20 that most Americans will not see by the time they're on their deathbed. But imagine the people this has created in Israel. It has created a generation of people who know what they're fighting for, who've stared right into the eyes of death and a death cult, and they are winning, and they are going to win.
I think that is a very fitting tribute to the heroes in the Israeli Defense Forces, just like Douglas Murray is a very fitting recipient of the Champion of Freedom War. Let's give one more round of applause and thanks to Douglas Murray.